All right, thank you. All right, it is Texas A&M tradition that we start all classes with howdy. Howdy. All right, we got some Aggies and future Aggies in the room. It's always interesting to stand in the back of the room and just observe as people are coming in. So one of the things I heard as people were coming into the room is a young man that said, we have to go in and sit and listen to a speech? So I'm hoping for that young man, wherever you are in this audience, I'm hoping I entertain you and maybe you might learn something about flying in space. So I flew on the Space Shuttle 4 times. My 4th mission was on the Space Shuttle Columbia in 2002. If you know anything about NASA history, the tragedy with Columbia occurred the very next time that orbiter flew in 2003. And during that accident, we lost Columbia and we lost the 7 crew members who were good friends of mine. That was mission STS-107. And they were supposed to go in front of us. We were STS-109. But the Hubble started to experience some technical difficulties with this gyroscopic system. The gyroscopes are used to point the telescope. If you can't point a telescope, you can't do science. And so we swapped orders and we went before the STS-107 crew. All right, so this is our crew. This also is demonstration, and astronauts come in all shapes and sizes. Yes, you can Google shortest astronaut ever, and you're going to find me. The gentleman in the middle is Captain Scott Altman, U.S. Navy captain. He's also retired now and in private industry. His claim to fame, if you've seen the movie Top Gun, he flew the fighter that buzzed the tower with Tom Cruise in it. And Tom Cruise actually came to visit us in the simulator. That's a really comical story because we were trying to be cool just like him and not get all excited that Tom Cruise was coming in the simulator with us for an hour, but we did set up a video camera. However, and one of my crewmates still has this footage, which is pretty funny, because in order to frame the shot, and we were doing this so that obviously Mr. Cruise could not tell we were filming his visit, they perfectly framed the shot on me. Yeah, you can see where this is going. So we have on video Tom Cruise coming up the ladder up to the flight deck and flashing that famous smile, and then we have 40 minutes of Tom Cruise on the flight deck from the neck down. All right. On the more serious things. We launched on March 1st of 2002, and we were the 4th mission to go and service the Hubble Space Telescope. Thankfully, the telescope was built to be serviced on orbit by human beings during spacewalks and robotically, and we ended up doing 5 servicing missions from the space shuttle over the course of time. Of course, the first one was pretty famous. It was to correct the optics. There was an optical issue in the telescope. So I was so looking forward to this mission. All mission assignments are pretty much mysteries, kind of like military assignments. You're never quite sure who decides who's going when and where. But my 4th mission, they actually called me down and said, we are going to assign you to one of these 2 missions that has very challenging robotic operations. Which one would you like to fly on? And I was shocked. And so one was to return to the space station. I had put up the first element of the space station. And one was Hubble servicing repair. Now, I saw Hubble on the ground before I ever flew as a young astronaut candidate. And I thought, Hubble is just such an icon of NASA because we took something that didn't go exactly according to plan. And then we recovered very nicely, right? Recovered the optics, and the Hubble has been producing scientific discovery for decades now. And so I thought, this is awesome. I get to fly on Hubble. I'm a flight engineer. Every single day of the flight will be really busy, really critical operations for me. And so he said, well, you choose. And I said, well, who's the other person? So he told me it was one of my astronaut classmates. So I called her down and I said, you're not going to believe this. We get to pick what mission we fly. So I told her which two, and she said she'd think about it. And she came in the next day, and she had flown the station assembly mission right after me. She came in and said, you know, I think I really want to go back to the space station. I said, okay, I'll take Hubble. And she walked out, and I was kind of jumping up and down. Yeah, I get to fly on Hubble. One of the first things that we did was to change out the solar arrays. Now, the solar arrays have been changed out once before because on orbit, there's atomic oxygen, there's micrometeorite and orbital debris, and there's things that can damage those very sensitive solar arrays. And so we needed to go change those out. Now, on the first mission to change out the solar arrays, one of them did not retract. And they actually had to throw it overboard. It went kind of flapping away like a large bird, 350 miles out. And so I have to admit there was some on-orbit wagering as to whether or not both of these would retract so that we could change them out, but everything went according to plan. And I'm going to show you a movie that shows you some of these. Of course, the way in which the telescope sees is through that large aperture door, which is opened in space. And it's a very large spacecraft, and you're going to see something in this film of what it looks like when something that large literally goes about a foot over your head. And you're going to see what some pretty intelligent people do in response to that. Space Shuttle Columbia was an amazing spacecraft. As you know, we don't have a current capability to orbit. Our astronauts today ride on a Soyuz rocket, right? We pay the Russian Space Agency, I won't say how much, but it's quite a bit of money for a seat on their spacecraft. And so when the shuttle was retired in 2011, it was kind of a devastating blow to all of NASA. Was there some flaws in the design? Yes, as in all spacecraft. Was it inherently risky? Every single time you sit on a spacecraft and launch human beings into space, there's some inherent risk there. But the Space Shuttle and Space Shuttle Columbia was an amazing vehicle. So here's the movie for today, or what it's like to go to work in space 300 miles above the Earth. And I will narrate this. So on launch morning, it's pretty interesting because you wake up knowing, hey, in a few hours I'm going to be several hundred miles above the Earth. So the first thing we do is we go down and get suited up in our large pressure suits. Those are in case we have an emergency during either ascent or entry. They are full pressure suits that will inflate. That's me. I'm like, yep, hi, I'm ready to go. Rick Linehan, our veterinarian astronaut. We do have a veterinarian astronaut. Mike Massimino, who's quite a character. And then we walk out that same building that Neil Armstrong walked out of, down that same ramp. And you're thinking about that. This is how you get into your seat. Of course, the vehicle's in the vertical. This is Scott. We call him Scooter, our commander. He's 6'6" and 225, so it's kind of a tight fit in there. And you can see underneath here, the parachute is in the seat, and then you strap into the parachute. So here we are, and again, so we're sitting in the vertical position. T-minus 6 seconds, the main engines come up to light. 375,000 pounds of horsepower, and then at T-minus 0, 7 million pounds of thrust. You're leaving town very rapidly. People always ask, what are you thinking about? That's my little head right there in the middle, bouncing around. First stage when you're on the solid rocket boosters is shake, rattle, and roll. One of the first things you do is to roll heads down to reduce stress on the vehicle. People always ask, what are you thinking? It's like, I'm thinking about nothing except my job from the time I get in that spacecraft. Because, of course, we've had things go wrong on the pad, like Apollo 1. We've had things go wrong during ascent, Challenger, and now we've had things go wrong during entry in Columbia on the subsequent mission. So just 2 minutes and 30 seconds later, those large solid rocket boosters come off, and there's actually a parachute that comes out, and they were eventually refurbished and retrieved. So there we are. That's the view our family as they, from the ground saw as they were waving goodbye to us. And then you get to orbit. I don't know if you could see the pressure on the seats, and of course that little clip got away, so it goes floating across. And then the external tank is jettisoned. that actually would heat up and eventually explode into just tiny little pieces, come back to the Earth. So this is our planned rendezvous coming from the bottom up, if you will, rendezvousing with an object that's going 17,500 miles per hour and Mach 25, which is, 5,000 meters per second. So here's what Hubble looked like as we were approaching. And then it was my job to reach out and grab it with the robotic arm. So I'm back there. Scott is manually controlling the orbiter final phases and trying to zero out the relative rates. That's his view. And then this is an exterior view of the arm as it comes over and goes over the grapple fixture, and that's me inside operating the arm, trying to make sure I don't miss it. That's the view that I have from our target on the end of that end effector. And then we were all really happy that we did grapple it, because my motto was, if I don't catch it, we don't get to work on it. So here is the Hubble attached to the arm, and here is these solar arrays that are now retracting. Okay? So each of those retracted, and then we actually went out and manually removed them, stowed them in the payload bay, brought them back to the European Space Agency who had designed them so that they could do some scientific analysis of the degradation of those solar arrays on orbit. We rotated the telescope. The telescope sits on a rotating platform so we could rotate what area of the telescope we wanted to work on. And then it was time to start out and do 5 consecutive days of spacewalks. In NASA terms, we call those EVAs, Extravehicular Activities. So here's this large solar array all rolled up. And that's a view from his helmet cam, so you can see the gloves. Now, of course, this is in microgravity. I mean, if I wanted to pick up this whole desk, I'd just pick it up with my fingertip, right? But it's all about controlling rates. You don't want to put too fast of a rate on things. So this is Rick. He's in a foot restraint on the end of the arm. The pointer's not exactly. And then this is how we stowed that solar array down into the payload bay and then secured it, and that's our big power tools. So we use big power tools out there during our spacewalk as well. So we always have somebody, kind of the choreographer of the spacewalk inside. We call them the IVA, Intervehicular Activity. That is another spacewalking crew member. And we alternated teams. One team went out 3 times, the other team went out 2 times. These are the new solar arrays that are still on Hubble today. And they're semi-rigid arrays, so they kind of open like a book. Now, the mass of this solar array, it was too dangerous. Normally, we tether everything to our spacewalking astronauts, because if they let go of something, now we've got something becoming its own satellite at 17,500 miles an hour that we may see again in a subsequent orbit, right? Which would be a very catastrophic situation. And so the mass of that solar array was too much to tether it to the individual for fear we might damage the suit. And so they just had to very gently walk it hand over hand, 270 degrees. And our motto, we kept reminding them, don't drop the solar array. Don't drop the solar array. So this is us inside. Again, the arm, so this is the extension of the arm that you can see here, the boom and the crew member on the end of the arm. Because as a spacewalking crew member, you always want to be in a foot restraint. Because as soon as I push on something, if I wasn't restrained, then I'm going to move away. Right? So it's all about being in a foot restraint so that you can put that those torques and forces into the work platform. So on the next day, we changed out that reaction wheel assembly that I talked about. The reaction wheels help to point the telescope. So that's the change out of the old and the new, and then installing the new one. And you can see very well designed to be done in space, has a handrail on it and so forth. And then we put some additional layers of protection on the Hubble as well. Now this is a pretty interesting view. He's up on the arm and you can see he's looking back at our windows and we're looking back at him looking towards the front. So you can see actually the front nose of the spacecraft. Day 3. Day 3 was going to be our day of either being famous or infamous, because on day 3, we were told to power down the Hubble for the first time since it had been deployed. Totally power it down, remove the power control assembly, and it was going to be a really long day. Our spacesuits are only designed to have about 8 hours worth of consumable. That spacewalk at a minimum was going to be probably 7 hours. And then we had a problem before we ever got out the door, and we had a water leak in the suit. And what you saw them doing was they grabbed another hard upper torso, and we started reconfiguring the suit. The ground was thinking, they're not going to go out today. There's no way the crew can pull this off. Believe it or not, we told the other guy whose suit was fine in the airlock, just take a nap while we reconfigure the spacesuit, get it ready, and send John out in that spacesuit. So this is the power control assembly. There were 36 independent connectors that have been connected, on the ground, and now it's been exposed to the environment of space. If one of those connectors hadn't come off, we couldn't do the change out. If, for some reason, we couldn't get it powered up, we had just killed the Hubble. So we were really concerned about this day. In fact, the preceding crew had said it was too risky. They weren't going to be the ones that killed Hubble. Somebody on my mission decided, we'll give it a go. So luckily, everything went according to plan. The other thing we did on this mission, and you can see we've got huge checklists. Every single step of every single procedure of every single day is tightly choreographed and trained, over a year or 2 or sometimes 3 years for some of these very complex missions. And so what we installed was a new camera system, and I'm going to show you some imagery from that camera system. It's called the Advanced Camera for Survey, ACS. And you can see, probably only somebody of a certain age can relate to this, but it's about the size of a phone booth. Everybody else is going, I have no idea what reference that is, but it's a pretty large object. And so you can see, again, in the arm, and we actually were going inside the telescope now. So we've opened up the doors, and we're doing our procedures inside the telescope. The other thing that we did is to restore cooling to a camera system that had been expended, because Hubble's initial life was only planned to be about 10 years. And so it's been going on and on and on for decades, and so we had expended all the coolant, and so we hung this giant radiator on the outside of Hubble to restore cooling to one of its camera systems. So everything that we needed to remove and replace, we had out in the payload bay. Now, interestingly enough, you never know when an emergency is going to come up. And so every single day at the end of these 5 spacewalks, we had to assume that, okay, overnight or from the time you come inside, we have to do an emergency deorbit. So we couldn't leave anything out. We couldn't leave any of our tools or equipment out. We had to start from scratch every day. And so that meant the first basically hour of the EVA was setting up all our tools again and setting up the foot restraint, setting up the work site. The last hour was doing all the cleanup, but you never know when an emergency could come up that you have to emergency deorbit, close the payload bay doors, quickly get rid of the telescope. I'm sorry, redeploy the telescope is what I meant to say. And so that's why we go through those lanes. So after 5 days of spacewalks, and there they are getting ready to move this radiator, took up the entire width of the payload bay of the shuttle, which is about 15 feet wide. And so you could see that large radiator, and you kind of had to pirouette it. And then we hung it, and then so we became both electricians and plumbers on this mission, because we had to have a conduit to run that coolant through the system to restore cooling to the camera. The telescope obviously has very sensitive components, because after all, it is a high-powered telescope, and so every time we go inside, they're always very cautious about us not causing what we call in the space business collateral damage, meaning that while we're inside trying to fix something, we don't break something. The other thing that you'll see is because of the materials on the boots, they don't ever want our boots inside the telescope. So you always see crew members with at least their feet sticking out. Sometimes you'll see a crew member actually kind of holding a guy's feet, and he's in the prone position inside the telescope. So that's what Hubble looked like once the solar arrays were removed and replaced, and then it was time to redeploy the Hubble. Now I did the redeploy, but this is Mike Massimino, and he trained for as long as I did to do all the backup. So I let him go in and grapple it when it was still fixed in the payload bay. But for the take it up out of the payload bay and deploy it back to space, I took over and did that task. And so the way in which we did it is I ungrappled, backed away with the robotic arm that you see attached, that white robotic arm, and then we fired the thrusters on the shuttle. And then this happened. So orbital mechanics took it right over our crew windows. So that huge telescope that I talked about literally went right here, and between it and us was a window, and everybody on the crew ducked. Everybody ducked. They did not simulate those dynamics in the simulator, nor simulate that mass, real mass coming over our heads. So even though we knew better, everybody ducked. And then Scott was flying the shuttle still, and I was still flying the robotic arm, but the other 5 individuals all overran us with cameras and laser rate finders, and so that's Hubble. We use the same thing that the police officers do to track your speed and distance. So this is Hubble redeployed in space, ready to continue on and do the scientific discovery that it was designed to. So we're now on flight day 9, and nobody's really eaten or taken well, you can't take a shower. You take a sponge bath. Most of the guys hadn't even shaved since we got to orbit. And so this is a little bit of what it's like to actually live in space. This is the cycle ergometer, and we had to move everything out of the airlock that we normally use for stowage, and so it became pretty cramped. So we had to move that bike up and down. So you can see Mike exercising there. It doesn't have a seat. You don't need a seat. You're floating. All you need to do is lock your feet in. Mike was a good boy on the EVA, so we fed him. And then people always say, what do you do in space when you're not working? You look out the window. You look back at the Earth. It is incredibly beautiful. I have a saying on my wall that my students often look at, and it says, what changes you isn't flying in space, it's seeing the Earth from space. It's an incredible, incredible view. For people of the Flat Earth Society, did you notice the curvature of the Earth? I get that question all the time. Will you talk to this relative of mine? All right, so that's pretty interesting. We fired the thrusters to do a slight orbital maneuver change, and you saw I became Superman, right? So you're in microgravity, and just that little bit of thrust causes that. Now we're coming in on entry. The vehicle heats up to 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's a firestorm out the window. That is the person sitting next to me, our veterinarian, Rick Linehan, and that white glow, he's looking in his mirror, looking out the overhead, and that long white glow is the tail. And he kept talking about it. Wow, that tail is just glowing white hot. Man, the tail of the orbiter, just, I can't believe how hot it is. Anybody else want to see it? And we were all like, nope, we're good. We're good. So this is the heads-up display. The shuttle is flown manually to landing. It looks like it's got sunglasses on almost, right? Because those are the windows. They're cool. That's an infrared camera view. We wait till 300 feet to lower the main landing gear. So the gear are cold because they've been stowed up in the belly of the orbiter. And then once we touch down, you'll see immediately, because we're touching down at about 200 knots, those wheels immediately spin up, and they'll go from black in this infrared view to just white hot, the tires and brakes. And because of that, we have a drag chute. And we didn't always have a drag chute in the shuttle, but we kept blowing tires and going through an awful lot of brakes. So now we have a drag chute to help slow us down. It's a very long runway, 15,000 feet. So it's about 3 miles long. So we got lots of stopping distance. And then we come to a full stop. And now you're back in gravity. And what you didn't hear is on the tape, as we started to take on G's, one of the crew members asked me, how tall do you feel now? And I said, about a foot. Because you're so used to microgravity, you actually grow a few inches of microgravity. We can talk about that later if you'd like. And then here we are at the end of the mission. There's a lot of neurovestibular system disturbances going on, and so most people have this very wide stance, and they're hoping they don't fall over, because crew members have occasionally done that right after getting off of a mission. All right. So now just a few pictures for your enjoyment. That's what I want to show. Hold on. This one, okay. All right, so anybody want to guess where that is? Yeah, because it popped up. Okay. All right, so if you're familiar with it, so what can you see from 350 miles up? In a pretty long lens. You can see Galveston Bay, you can see I-45. If you look closely, you can see the 610 loop. That's pretty cool. It's also why flying in space is probably one of the most humbling experiences you can have. You're orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes. Every once in a while, we get this orbital path that takes us over Houston because Hubble's inclination is 28.5 degrees. So that means our orbital path is between 28.5 north and 28.5 south. Houston's about 28.5. And so, but do we fly over the same point all the time? No. Why is that? Because the Earth's rotating underneath us. So we don't fly over the same point all the time, but on those days when we get to fly over Houston and take pictures, it's really incredible because you're literally, going around the Earth every 90 minutes, and every few days you get just a glimpse, for literally seconds, of your whole world. And you look down and and that little dot is my family, my work, my friends. It is a very, very, very humbling experience. Where is that? Florida. Okay, where we launch from, where we're going to land in a few days. So we were hoping most of the clouds went away. That's those white streaks. You can also see the jet contrails if you look pretty closely down in the lower part, down here. All right, they're going to get harder. All right, how about this one? It's very distinguishable from space. Anybody know? Not Hawaii. Land. It is land. It is land and water. You could be a future astronaut. Okay, on the one side, yes. On the other side, this is the Galapagos Islands. Very distinguishable. Almost looks like a seahorse, right? We love to fly over the Galapagos and take pictures. Okay. And then this is the Sinai Peninsula. Mediterranean Sea, down through the Red Sea, Saudi Arabia. Okay. Orbital sunrise and sunset. You're flying around the Earth every 90 minutes, so every 90 minutes you get to see orbital sunrise and sunset. And they're incredibly beautiful. It is also right at sunrise and sunset where you can see and have an appreciation for how small that atmospheric band is that's around our planet. One of the things for most astronauts, I know for me personally, is once you've flown in space, and over 12 years, I saw changes in our Earth, just over 12 years. Deforestation, for example. And you think, in a geological time sense, that's just one little sliver of time. If things are changing that rapidly because of what we're doing, we probably want to rethink that. And so most astronauts become environmentalists. My family will tell you I am always after them not to use plastic bags, right? And things like that. I am a firm environmentalist because of the changes that I've seen in our Earth and because of how fragile I know that the atmosphere is because I've seen it. But at orbital sunrise and sunset, you'll see blues and oranges and yellows and greens. And even though these pictures look really great, I've come back from a mission and I've had my family or my friends with me as we've reviewed our photography because once upon a time this was actually film, not electronic. This mission, a lot of it was electronic. And so it would take some time to go ahead and get that film ready for review. And we bring our families in, kind of have a pizza party, and all the family members, every time we put up a new picture, ooh, ah. And those of us that have been there said, it was just a little bit better than that though, right? So it's like standing on the edge of the rim of the Grand Canyon and just taking it in And then maybe you snap a picture and you get home and you're like, oh, that didn't capture it. And so, you know, it's that experience of seeing it up close. Now, these are some of the photos that were taken by the camera system that we put in, the Advanced Camera for Survey. So about 2 weeks after our mission, we knew that camera was operational, which, you know, was really good. And then when we started receiving the first images and the first data from the Space Telescope Science Institute, it was just incredible. Look at this. You know, that image is roughly 290,000 light years across. That's the kind of scientific discovery that Hubble is enabling. This one's called the Tadpole Galaxy. 420 million light years away. So remember, putting that telescope out in orbit above our atmosphere, you're not looking through any atmospheric aberrations, right? There's no weather to worry about up there. There's no atmospheric aberrations to worry about. And so here on the ground, some of our best telescopes are up in the mountains, right? But putting a telescope in space can allow us to see so much further and so much clearer into the universe. This is one of my favorites, the Cone Nebula. You might wonder, how do they color these? And they actually have a system based on the digital information of how they're going to color these images to reveal what they're showing. And finally, this is called the Omega Nebula and the Swan Nebula. So to be on a mission, this is why I wanted to fly on Hubble. I had 4 incredible missions, but we have a saying in the astronaut office, all missions are good missions, but some are just a little better than others. And this might fall into that category, because to be a part of that legacy and all the crews who have deployed the Hubble, worked on the Hubble over the decades, really feel a part of this big program. And it's really great, because I can go into any school in this country and talk to them about Hubble, and they've heard of Hubble, they've seen images from Hubble, and so it's really been beneficial to us. All right, now's your time to ask questions. So this is, as a professor, I rarely say pull out your phones or your devices, but you can do that. So if anybody's got any questions, I use this Slido technique. You can go to slido.com, or if you have the Slido app, that's the code 2467. But right now, and then it will rank the questions for me as we go along. But right now, anybody have any questions of me?
So you mentioned, your view of the Earth is immaculate, but were there any other celestial bodies you can see from the space station?
I mean, you can obviously see the Milky Way. You can see, people always ask, like the moon, or planets. Do they look any differently? We're only a couple hundred miles up. So they don't look tremendously different in terms of distance than they do here on the surface of the Earth. But what's different is, again, you're not looking through the atmosphere. So I have never seen more stars in my entire life than a night on orbit, a night pass on orbit. Because I don't care where you go in this country, because of light pollution or just because of weather or just because you're looking through the atmosphere, you will not, I've seen a lot out in Arizona, right, out in the high deserts in Arizona, but there's nothing like looking at the stars outside the window of the spacecraft. It is just incredible. And so that's what we do. In fact, when we can't sleep, and we had 7 crew members on this mission, we had 4 space suits, we had 7 launch and entry suits, we had 7 seats, 7 parachutes, all of our clothes and our tools and equipment, and so there wasn't a lot of space for us. Now in space, when you talk about sleeping arrangements, somebody could sleep on the ceiling. This room, when I tell you, you could just hang out over there up in that corner and watch this lecture, or hang out on the ceiling, or float wherever you want, right? This room now becomes huge. And the spacecraft, when you get in it on the ground, appears to be very small. I take people to our mock-ups all the time, and they look at me and go, how did you live here for 2 weeks with a bunch of guys? But remember, you can use all 3 dimensions. And so We usually have a rule that says nobody sleeps on the flight deck, but we literally could not fit all 7 of us on the mid-deck, so the commander and a couple other people slept on the flight deck. And the reason for that is because if you can't sleep, everybody wants to go look out the window, because there's only one place in the entire world you can do that, and that's in space. And just to soak it in, to soak in the experience is well worth it. Any other questions? Yes?
So has the dumping of space junk into the orbit of the Earth provided a significant obstacle to
That's an excellent question. Yes, so micrometeorite orbital debris is a huge issue, not only in low Earth orbit, but even in geostationary orbit. Because some of the techniques when spacecraft are done with their useful life, some people just boost them to a higher altitude. And so, or somebody does a test, or a spacecraft should have an anomaly and explode, and now you've got all those fragments up there. And I don't care if it's, something the size of a dime and a few ounces. If it makes contact at Mach 25 with our spacecraft, it's going to cause catastrophic damage. So it is becoming more and more and more of a problem. The problem is this: we can model it. We actually have agencies that track it. We know how many pieces of a certain size are out there, but nobody owns space, right? We own airspace over countries, right? So we declare what is U.S. airspace. Who owns space? So whose job is it to figure out, and that's going to be a very complex issue, how you go clean up the environment of space? All the stuff that's already up there. Because the higher it is, the longer it's going to take to come down. It's an exponential function. The higher it is, the longer the life is at that altitude. All right, we got a couple questions here. If you're orbiting around Earth, how do you get long exposure photos if you're moving and the Earth blocks your vision? First of all, stability is the key to taking photographs on orbit. So the interesting thing about being an astronaut is astronaut training is every discipline you can ever think of. Astronaut training includes training on the cameras and video, because to tell this story, the only people who are taking these photos and videos are astronauts, right? So we have to know something about geology. We have to know something about astrophysics. We have to know something about, orbital mechanics. We have to know all the mechanical systems, the electrical systems, the computer systems, be software experts. And so we go through an awful lot of training, but taking a photo on orbit, just like doing anything on orbit, is much more complex. So it's all about stability. Now, we don't wear shoes on orbit because, we're not standing, we're floating. But what we do have to worry about is when people wrap their legs around something to get stability, to take a picture, to do a task, that they don't throw switches with their toes inadvertently, because you don't want to shut down the main computers on the shuttle because you were grabbing onto something and your toe hit it. So we pretty much block everything on orbit so that can't happen. The other thing is when people first get to orbit, they understand that it doesn't take much force to move from point A to point B. So if I just want to move across the room, I'll just push lightly and I'll go. Some people have a hard time rating how much force is required, and so for those, what you hear is they'll push off, and then you hear, whoa, 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 and then they'll crash into something and everything goes flying. And so we worry about people having things like lacerations on orbit. So that's another thing we have to get trained in. 2 of our crew members are trained to be doctors. Now, we didn't have a doctor on our mission. Closest thing we had a veterinarian. He was a large animal vet, as in elephants. And the 2 crew surgeons were the veterinarian, large animal specialist, and the fighter pilot. So we got to pick. We got to say, okay, if you get sick, who do you want working on you? If you need stitches, who do you want working on you? Let's see, a guy that works on elephants or a fighter pilot? I'm taking the fighter pilot. All right, let's see. What was the hardest part of your astronaut training? EVAs are pretty tough. Spacewalks are pretty tough, physically demanding. Certainly demanding if the suit doesn't fit you well. That's been in the news a lot, you know. I will not make any political statements one way or the other, but spacesuits only come in 3 sizes, medium, large, and extra large. As you can imagine, I'm none of those 3. We did do some design of a small spacesuit, but it was going to be pretty costly to build that specific suit, and so the program opted not to have it. But I've spent some time in the suit. We train for spacewalks in a water tank. So you go into the water tank, that suit is filled with air, because it's a pressurized suit. And so if you put a big suit, almost like a balloon in a pool, what's it going to do? It's going to float, right? So we have to weight people down until they're neutrally buoyant. So we put weights on their arms and legs so they're neutrally buoyant. They don't rise or fall. But now as you move your arm and move a piece of equipment, you're still fighting the viscosity of the water. So it's harder in the water tank than it is in space. And sometimes people end up using too much force in space because they are used to training and having it be a little bit harder. The other thing is if you're my size and the suit doesn't fit very well, in the water you're still in a 1G environment, so when I go heads down, first of all, I feel like I'm heads down and then I go shooting to the top of my helmet, right? And I flip heads up and I go shooting to my feet or to the back of the suit. And so, of course, in space, you would be floating inside your suit. But spacewalks are pretty physically demanding. How do you tell if you're right side up or upside down? Well, right side up or upside down doesn't have much meaning in a microgravity environment. But of course, somebody designed that vehicles, and so there are labels. So the primary cue is a label that's written usually with respect to a 1G environment. So you can look at the writing and say, okay, you know, from a 1G environment. But I had a friend on one of my flights that ate all his meals upside down because he could. You know, I slept in every possible configuration. You don't, you know, obviously without the force of gravity, your neurovestibular system is not being accelerated like it is here on Earth, and so you don't feel like you're upside down. It literally has no meaning. And so it is a very relaxed environment. As I talked about, without that force of gravity, of course it goes from head to feet, you grow. I grew 2 inches in space. It's awesome. Of course, I always say space is a great equalizer because I just float as high as everybody else, right? So it was a great equalizer. But those same effects cause some biomedical issues. And one of the ones that we're dealing with now, especially as crew members are spending 6 months or up to a year on the space station, is we now have what happens in the force of gravity, you know, head to foot. Now you go to orbit. You don't have that. Things start to equalize. The fluid shift from your lower body to your upper body. And your body is not that astute, so it starts thinking it's in fluid overload, so it changes some of your hormones, and you start diuresing a lot of fluid. The other thing is that your bones aren't under a gravitational environment, aren't being stressed. You start losing bone mineral density at the same time you're diuresing, so the risk of a kidney stone goes way up, because what are you diuresing? Sodium, calcium, all those things that form kidney stones. A big risk. Also interocular pressure. We've seen crew members that come back and their visual acuity's changed up to 2 diopters over the course of their flight and not recovered. And we've seen things like, they call it globe flattening. Because of that increased pressure, the globe of the eye actually changes shape. Whether or not it recovers, you know, is something that we're still trying to determine. Some crew members it recovers, some crew members it does not. And so, do I have any residual effects? No, but at first they thought shuttle crew members don't have that experience. But every single one of us, including me, on my first flight I was in my early 30s. And as soon as I got to orbit and went to read that checklist, I did what I have to do today, which is this. And so I could tell, I thought, wow. I mean, in just like a day or two, my vision's changed. Now, it changed back immediately when I came back because, you know, we were only up there a couple weeks. But I noticed it, and other crew members noticed it. It wasn't until just a few years ago that they retrospectively went back and asked shuttle crew members who had vision changes on orbit. And so it turns out that about 30 to 40% of shuttle astronauts experience visual changes, all recoverable in the shorter duration, not, unfortunately, in the long duration crew members. All right, we'll take another one off the... What are our next steps in space exploration? So our next step is to go beyond LEO, go beyond low Earth orbit, right? So we've got the space station. The space station is tremendous. It's a named national laboratory doing incredible science, incredible activities, getting ready for those missions. What do I believe is the single limiting factor of going beyond LEO and extending our mission durations from 6 months to 2 years, like in a mission to Mars? The understanding of human physiology. I told you there are still risks with respect to human physiology that we don't fully understand. And we shouldn't be exposing people to risks that we don't understand fully, right? And so understanding the human physiological effects, we have only had one crew member fly in excess of 6 months. Now the Russians have had a lot of crew members fly in excess of 6 months, but they don't necessarily share that medical data. They don't necessarily use the same equipment, calibrated to the same standards that we have. And so we've only had one crew member, Scott Kelly, who's flown for 1 year. We have an N of 1. And so before we make that jump to a 2-year-long mission, we need to do longer and longer missions here in low Earth orbit, fully understand, so if something does go wrong, we can bring them home and bring them home rapidly. All right, let me take 2 more, maybe just at random. Ever go back to the moon? Well, that's the plan now. Go back to the moon in the next 5 years, right? People say, why go back to the moon? Even some of the astronauts who have been to the moon say, we've been there, done that. But, again, it's literally a quantum leap to go to Mars from a whole lot of perspectives. So why not have a lunar base or something in a lunar orbit to base off of to do those deeper and deeper missions until we fully understand those capabilities. A few years ago, we probably wouldn't have been talking about 3D printing our tools or maybe even our habitats. Now we're exploring that. So let's explore some of the technology. Let's explore human physiological effects on the moon when you're a few days away versus months away, like on Mars. Anybody else? Yes?
What do you think is the future of the Hubble as technology improves? Are we going to get stronger, going to be able to see further?
So the next generation telescope is the James Webb Telescope that has newer technologies, but that's been under development for more than a decade now. But yes, it will have expanded capability. Yes? How big is the Milky Way? It's really big. So when you're standing here on Earth and you look out, you can see the Milky Way sometimes, right? Well, now when we're flying in the space shuttle, we're only a couple hundred miles above the Earth, as opposed to some of those things and some of those, planetary objects that are light years away. So again, it's not that we're that much closer to things and see them better, but we're not looking through the atmosphere. Yes, sir. Do you have a question?
How bright is the Milky Way?
How bright is it? Well, it's bright enough that you can see it from the Earth, right? All right. How are we doing on time? Okay. We need to wrap it up, so I'll take one more. Right there. No, I would say you're very busy. And the difference is when you wake up, you're at work. I was in the military, and there's an element of that too, right? Especially when you're out in the field, you wake up, you're at work. But this is the ultimate. You wake up, before you've even brushed your teeth, they're telling you to reconfigure the cryogenic system on the shuttle. You never know when you're going to have an emergency, and we've had that happen. An errant state vector command was once sent to an orbiter, and it was tumbling through the sky. And so the crew got woken up with an alarm, looked out the window, and they're literally tumbling through the sky. And So I think the difference is that you're very, very busy. It's hard to go to sleep. Sleeping in space is the hardest thing because physiologically you don't feel any differently. And it took me days on my first mission to figure out I got to make it feel like when I'm on Earth. And so I found a flat surface and I bungeed myself as tight as I could to it so I could almost feel like I was in bed. And I could show you a picture, I almost did, but it's probably not fair. I don't think we told him we took it when the commander was sleeping. But you wake up in the middle of the night, of course you're in a sleeping bag, but it doesn't have arms as a sleeping bag. So you wake up and it's kind of like waking up to, a museum of zombies or something. There's floating body parts everywhere. And we have a pillow, but in order to use the pillow, you got to Velcro your head to the pillow. So that's an excellent question. Well, thank you so much for braving the weather and coming out. I hope you enjoy it.